So we're going to see another example of factoring a quadratic function. But this time we're going to find that we have imaginary zeros rather than the real numbers in our last example. So let's say we start with x squared plus 36. To set up our box, we would have, well, a is 1, c is 36, so a times c is 36. And what is b? Take a moment, think about this, and then we'll come back together. What was that? 0? Yes, b is 0. Because there's no x term, b must be 0. So we want numbers that multiply to negative 36 and add up to 0. Well, two numbers that add up to 0 and multiply to something like 36 are 6 and negative 6. But when we multiply negative 6 and 6, we get negative 36. So these two numbers don't work. So our x method doesn't immediately appear to work. But one thing we can do is pretend that we were solving this instead. So if we set this equal to 0, we now have another option because we can subtract 36 from both sides. So I'll have x squared equals negative 36. Taking the square root on both sides, we have x is equal to the square root of negative 36, which would be the positive or negative 6 times I. Notice that we need to include both the positive and the negative. Whenever we're solving a quadratic function, we get two solutions. So one of them is our positive root, the other is our negative root. And now to write this as factors, you would have x plus 6i times x minus 6i. And that would be the end of our problem. But it's important to note one more thing. What's the relationship between x plus 6i and x minus 6i? Hopefully you've realized that these two numbers are conjugates. So there's actually a theorem in algebra called the conjugate pair theorem that says whenever we have an imaginary zero of a polynomial function, such as a quadratic function, the conjugate is also a 0. So if we have x plus 6i, we must have x minus 6i because those two numbers are conjugates. In our next video, we'll do an example of a quadratic function with imaginary roots that requires us to use the quadratic formula rather than this method of setting it equal to 0.